The morning sun sliced through the glass walls of Miami International Airport, casting a golden haze over Terminal D, where travelers bustled in a restless dance of urgency. It was 7:45 a.m. on a swelteringly unbearable Monday in June 2025, and the terminal buzzed with the hum of announcements, the clatter of rolling suitcases and the murmur of hurried conversations. The air carried the faint scent of jet fuel mingled with overpriced coffee from a nearby kiosk, where a barista shouted orders over the din. Beneath this orchestrated chaos, a different kind of tension simmered, one that went unnoticed by most, but not by Naomi Sinclair. At Gate 17, Naomi stood like a beacon of unyielding grace, her presence commanding attention without a single word. At 38, she was a vision of power, her deep cocoa skin radiant under the fluorescent lights, her almond-shaped hazel eyes sharp with a quiet intensity. Her shoulder-length curls, dyed a striking silver, framed her face like a crown, catching the light in a defiant shimmer. She wore a sleek emerald green blazer over a cream silk blouse paired with tailored black trousers and polished Oxford shoes, a silver pendant necklace, a hummingbird, a gift from her grandmother in Savannah, Georgia, glinting at her throat. Naomi adjusted the strap of her charcoal gray leather briefcase, her fingers steady despite the familiar unease that airports always stirred in her. As the CEO of Sinclair Ventures, a tech firm revolutionizing logistics for underserved communities, she'd navigated boardrooms and biases across the globe. But today, as she approached the check-in counter, a prickling sensation crept up her spine, a warning she'd learned to heed. The gate agent, Chloe Patterson, stood behind the counter, her auburn hair pulled into a high ponytail, her pale freckled face set with a practiced smile that didn't reach her green eyes. At 32, Chloe wore her airline uniform, a navy blazer with a crisp white shirt, like a shield, her nameplate gleaming with corporate precision. Her gaze flicked over Naomi, lingering on her silver hair, her impeccable attire, the unapologetic blackness of her presence before her lips curled into a smirk, a weapon masquerading as warmth. "Boarding pass, please," Chloe said, her tone clipped. Naomi handed it over, her voice smooth and measured, tinged with the soft lilt of her Savannah upbringing. "I'm confirming my seat. 3B, business class." Chloe's smirk widened as she tapped at her keyboard with exaggerated flair, her movements almost performative. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, each word a carefully crafted barb. "There's been a reassignment. You're now in economy, seat 52C. Naomi's hazel eyes narrowed, her pulse steady but her mind racing, piecing together the implications with precision. "I booked 3B months ago," she replied, her voice even, refusing to rise to the bait. Chloe shrugged, her ponytail swishing as she leaned back. "Systems make mistakes," she said, her tone light but laced with condescension. "You know how it is." But the glint in her green eyes told a different story, one of deliberate dismissal, a judgment made in the split second she'd sized Naomi up, a calculation of worth based on the color of her skin, the shape of her words. Behind Naomi, the line of passengers shifted, their impatience palpable. A man in a wrinkled polo shirt muttered, "Just take the seat and move on," his words slicing through the air, his tone thick with entitlement. A young woman with earbuds glanced at Naomi, then away, her discomfort a silent betrayal. Naomi's gaze shifted to the counter, where a junior staffer named Lucas hovered, his curly black hair damp with sweat, his anxious brown eyes darting between Chloe and the clipboard in his hands. He leaned in, whispering something to Chloe, his voice low but urgent. Naomi caught fragments. "They said to move her. Doesn't fit the image." Before Chloe waved him off with a sharp gesture, her smile never faltering but her eyes flashing, with irritation. The air thickened with unspoken bias, a quiet violence wrapped in customer service smiles, a system so seamless in its cruelty that it went unnoticed by most, but not by Naomi. She stood taller, her emerald green blazer a beacon of defiance, her silver pendant catching the light like a flame, the weight of every sidelong glance Every whispered judgment she'd endured pressed into her spine, not as a burden, but as a shield. She felt the passengers' stares, their silence a complicity that cut deeper than Chloe's words. This wasn't about a seat. It was about a decision made in the space of a glance, a system that had already decided her worth. But as the terminal buzzed with routine, what inferno was Naomi Sinclair about to unleash? Naomi Sinclair stepped away from the check-in counter at Gate 17, her emerald green blazer cutting a sharp silhouette against the sterile white of Miami International Airport's Terminal D. The morning sun had climbed higher, its golden rays, now a harsh glare through the glass walls, reflecting off the marble floors and casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her like accusing fingers. The terminal buzzed with the relentless rhythm of travel, announcements crackling overhead, suitcases clattering, and the low hum of conversations blending into a cacophony that felt both distant and suffocating. Naomi moved with deliberate grace, her polished Oxford shoes clicking softly against the floor as she settled into a molded plastic chair near the far wall, her charcoal gray leather briefcase resting by her feet. Her silver curls shimmered under the fluorescent lights, her hazel eyes unreadable, but beneath her composed exterior, a storm was gathering, a storm fueled by the quiet violence she'd just endured. She watched Chloe Patterson with the precision of a hawk, her gaze steady and unflinching. Chloe, her auburn ponytail swishing with each movement, continued her gate duties, her freckled face set with a plastic smile that stretched thinner with every passing minute. Her green eyes darted nervously now, betraying the cracks in her facade, as she processed boarding passes with mechanical efficiency. Naomi noticed the subtle tremor in Chloe's hands as she handed a boarding pass to a passenger, a middle-aged man in a polo shirt, the same one who'd muttered at Naomi to move on. Chloe's smile brightened for him, her voice lilting with a warmth that had been absent moments ago. "Enjoy your flight, sir," she said, her tone syrupy sweet, a stark contrast to the cold dismissal she'd offered Naomi. The man nodded, oblivious to the undercurrent of bias that had just played out, and shuffled toward the jet bridge, his privilege a shield Naomi had never been afforded. Naomi's hazel eyes shifted to the other staff members, her mind cataloging every detail with the meticulousness of a strategist. Lucas, the junior staffer with curly black hair and anxious brown eyes, hovered near the counter, his clipboard clutched like a lifeline. His navy uniform was slightly wrinkled, a sign of the long shift he'd already endured, and his hands fidgeted as he glanced at Naomi, then quickly away, his guilt a palpable weight in the air. Naomi remembered his whispered words. "They said to move her. Doesn't fit the image." And the way Chloe had waved him off, her authority a silent command to comply. Lucas's discomfort was evident in the way he shifted his weight, his shoulders slumping as if trying to make himself smaller, invisible. But Naomi saw him. She saw everything. A young flight attendant approached the counter, her navy uniform, crisp, her brunette hair tied in a neat ponytail that swayed as she moved. Her name tag read Grace, and her brown eyes flickered with unease as she leaned in to speak with Chloe, her voice low but urgent. "Are we sure about that reassignment?" Grace asked, her tone hesitant, her fingers brushing nervously against the lapel of her blazer. Chloe's smile tightened, her green eyes flashing with irritation. "It's handled," she snapped, her voice low but sharp, a warning wrapped in a whisper. Grace hesitated, her lips parting as if to protest. But then, she ducked her head, her courage withering under the weight of Chloe's authority. She stepped back, her movements jerky, and cast a fleeting glance at Naomi before hurrying toward the jet bridge, her silence a louder betrayal than any words. Naomi felt the weight of that silence settle into her bones. Not just Grace's, but the silence of the passengers who'd stood behind her, who'd witnessed the exchange but said nothing. A businessman in a gray suit had tapped his foot impatiently, his eyes avoiding hers as if her presence were an inconvenience. A young woman with earbuds had buried herself in her phone, her discomfort a shield against the injustice unfolding before her. The terminal was a microcosm of complicity, a place where silence was a currency, traded for comfort, for the illusion of fairness. Naomi's fingers tightened around the strap of her briefcase, her silver pendant, the hummingbird, from her grandmother, glinting like a beacon of resilience at her throat. She thought of her grandmother's stories, of the Jim Crow South, of the quiet battles fought in the shadows, battles that had taught Naomi the power of stillness, the power of watching, waiting, striking when the moment was right. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket, a discreet vibration that pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. A single word from her executive assistant, a woman who'd been her right hand for a decade, ready. The message was a signal, a confirmation that the gears of Naomi's plan were already turning, a plan forged in the crucible of countless dismissals, countless moments where the world had tried to erase her. The corner of her mouth twitched, not into a smile but into a thin line of resolve. A promise to herself and to every person who'd ever been diminished by a system designed to exclude. She wasn't just a passenger. She was a force, a reckoning they'd underestimated. Naomi leaned back in her chair, her hazel eyes never leaving Chloe, her silver curls catching the light like a crown of fire. The terminal buzzed on, oblivious to the shift in the air, but Naomi felt it. A ripple before the wave, a spark before the blaze. As the final boarding call echoed through the speakers, what silent rebellion was Naomi Sinclair about to ignite? The hum of Miami International Airport's Terminal D had shifted by late morning, the golden haze of sunrise giving way to a harsh, unrelenting glare that poured through the glass walls, illuminating every corner with a sterile clarity. At gate 17, the final boarding call for Naomi Sinclair's flight to Denver echoed through the speakers, a robotic voice cutting through the clamor of travelers, a mix of tired families, impatient business types, and harried staff rushing to clear the gate. But Naomi remained seated in her molded plastic chair near the far wall, her charcoal gray leather briefcase resting by her feet, her emerald green blazer a stark contrast to the muted grays of the terminal. Her silver curls caught the light, like a crown of defiance, her hazel eyes fixed on the counter where Chloe Patterson stood, her auburn ponytail now slightly frayed, her freckled face flushed with a tension she could no longer hide. The air around Naomi crackled with an unspoken energy, a ripple of something larger, something inevitable, that the bustling terminal couldn't quite drown out. Chloe's movements had grown erratic, her green eyes darting between her computer screen and the dwindling line of passengers, her plastic smile stretched so thin it threatened to snap. She fumbled with a boarding pass, her fingers trembling as she handed it to a passenger, her voice strained as she muttered, "Enjoy your flight." Naomi watched her, her gaze steady, her mind a storm of calculation beneath her composed exterior. She'd seen the cracks forming, the way Chloe's confidence had faltered after their exchange, the way her hands shook as she typed, the way her eyes flickered with unease every time they met Naomi's unflinching stare. It wasn't just guilt. It was the dawning realization that she'd underestimated the woman she'd so casually dismissed, the woman whose worth she'd calculated in the space of a glance. Naomi's attention shifted to Lucas, the junior staffer with curly black hair and anxious brown eyes who stood near the counter, his clipboard now abandoned on a nearby desk. His navy uniform was wrinkled, his shoulders slumped as he whispered into a handheld radio, his voice low but urgent. "There's a glitch in the system," he said, his words barely audible over the terminal's noise, but Naomi caught them, her ears attuned to every shift in the atmosphere. "Vendor codes are failing. Priority systems are flagged for review." He glanced at Chloe, his brown eyes wide with panic, but she waved him off with a sharp gesture, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Fix it," she snapped, her voice a harsh whisper, her freckled face paling as she turned back to her screen, her fingers flying across the keyboard in a desperate attempt to regain control. Grace, the young flight attendant with a brunette, ponytail and a navy uniform, lingered near the jet bridge, her brown eyes darting between Chloe and Naomi, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She'd witnessed the reassignment, heard Chloe's dismissive tone, seen the unspoken bias play out in real time, and now the weight of her silence pressed against her chest like a stone. Grace took a hesitant step toward the counter, her lips parting as if to speak, but then she froze, her courage faltering under the weight of professional decorum. She adjusted her name tag with trembling fingers, her gaze dropping to the floor as she turned back toward the jet bridge. Her silence, a choice she already regretted. Naomi saw it all. The flicker of guilt in Grace's eyes, the way she'd almost spoken up but didn't, the way the system's invisible rules held her in check. It was a pattern Naomi knew too well, a pattern she'd spent her career dismantling, piece by silent piece. Naomi's phone buzzed again in her pocket. A second message from her executive assistant lighting up the screen. Contracts frozen. Legal team on standby. The words were a quiet confirmation, a signal that the gears of her plan were not just turning, they were accelerating. Naomi's hazel eyes darkened with resolve, her silver pendant, the hummingbird from her grandmother, glinting at her throat, like a talisman of resilience. She thought of her grandmother's stories, of the quiet battles fought in the Jim Crow South, of the way her ancestors had turned silence into a weapon, a shield, a spark that ignited change. Naomi wasn't here to shout or protest. She was here to dismantle, to expose, to rebuild. Sinclair Ventures wasn't just a tech firm. It was a lifeline for communities the world had forgotten, a testament to Naomi's belief that systems could be rebuilt with equity at their core. And now that belief was about to become a weapon. The terminal screens above the counter flickered briefly, a glitch that caused passenger manifests to flash inconsistently, drawing a sharp gasp from Chloe. "What now?" she muttered, her voice trembling as she tapped at her keyboard, her freckled face paling further. Lucas rushed to her side, his brown eyes wide with panic. "It's spreading," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The whole system, check-ins, boarding queues, it's locking us out." Chloe's green eyes darted to Naomi, a flash, of fear crossing her face before she masked it with a forced smile, her hands trembling as she tried to regain control. But Naomi remained still, her emerald green blazer a beacon of calm amidst the growing chaos, her silver curls a crown of quiet fury. The terminal buzzed on, oblivious to the shift, but Naomi felt it. A tremor before the earthquake, a spark before the inferno. As the screens flickered again, what silent storm was Naomi Sinclair about to unleash? The late morning light in Miami International Airport's Terminal D had turned unforgiving, the sun's harsh glare bouncing off the glass walls and marble floors, casting a stark brilliance that exposed every flaw, every fracture in the terminal's polished facade. At Gate 17, the chaos that had begun as a flicker on the screens now roared into a full-blown crisis, the once smooth machinery of travel grinding to a halt. Passengers crowded the counter, their voices rising in a cacophony of frustration. Delayed flights, glitching check-ins and boarding passes that refused to scan. Overhead, the announcement system crackled with static, a robotic voice stuttering through updates that only deepened the confusion. Amidst this unraveling, Naomi Sinclair remained an anchor of calm, seated in her molded plastic chair near the far wall, her emerald green blazer a vivid contrast to the chaos, her silver curls shimmering like a crown under the fluorescent lights. Her hazel eyes, sharp and unyielding, tracked every movement, every crack in the system she'd set in motion. Chloe Patterson stood behind the counter, her auburn ponytail now completely unraveled, strands of hair clinging to her sweat-dampened forehead, her freckled face pale with panic. Her green eyes darted wildly between her computer screen and the growing crowd, her hands trembling as she tried to process a boarding pass that refused to cooperate. "This isn't working," she snapped at Lucas, her voice shrill, her navy blazer creased from hours of mounting stress. Lucas, the junior staffer with curly black hair and anxious brown eyes, hovered beside her, his own uniform disheveled, his clipboard forgotten on the counter. "The whole system's down," he said, his voice trembling as he clutched a handheld radio, static crackling through the speaker. "They're saying it's not just us. Vendor contracts are frozen, priority systems are locked. We can't even reassign seats." Chloe's gaze flicked to Naomi, a flash of fear crossing her face before she masked it with a forced smile, her hands fumbling to regain control. But control was slipping through her fingers like sand. In a glass-walled office overlooking the gate, shift supervisor Dennis Marks paced, his thinning gray hair slick with sweat, his wiry frame tense as he barked into his phone. At 45, Dennis had built his career on maintaining order, on keeping the system running smoothly. But now that system was crumbling, and he felt the weight of it pressing against his chest. "What do you mean, frozen?" he shouted, his voice hoarse, his gray suit jacket unbuttoned in a rare lapse of composure. "We're talking about Sinclair Ventures. Do you know who they are? They handle logistics for half the underserved markets in the country. If they pull out, we're done." He slammed the phone down, his hands shaking as he turned to the window, his eyes scanning the terminal below. He spotted Naomi seated calmly, her emerald green blazer a beacon of defiance, her silver pendant, the hummingbird from her grandmother, glinting like a promise of retribution. Dennis's stomach churned. He knew this wasn't a glitch. This was a reckoning, and it bore Naomi Sinclair's name. Grace, the young flight attendant with a brunette ponytail, stood frozen near the jet bridge, her navy uniform still crisp, but her brown eyes wide with guilt. She'd seen the reassignment, heard Chloe's dismissive tone, witnessed the bias unfold in real time, and done nothing. Now, as the terminal descended into chaos, the weight of her silence felt suffocating. She took a hesitant step toward the counter, her lips parting as if to speak, but the words caught in her throat. A passenger, a mother with a toddler in her arms, shoved past her, shouting at Chloe about a missed connection, and Grace shrank back, her hands trembling as she adjusted her name tag, her courage faltering once again. But Naomi saw her, saw the guilt etched into her features, saw the way her silence had become a chain. Naomi's hazel eyes softened for a moment, not with forgiveness, but with understanding. She knew the cost of silence, the way it bound people, to systems they didn't even realize they were upholding. Naomi's phone buzzed again, a third message from her executive assistant flashing across the screen. Meetings canceled, partners notified. The words were a quiet confirmation, a signal that her plan was moving faster than even she'd anticipated. Sinclair Ventures wasn't just pulling out of contracts, it was severing ties, withdrawing trust and sending a message that reverberated through corporate channels like a shockwave. Naomi leaned back in her chair, her silver curls catching the light, her emerald green blazer a symbol of her unyielding resolve. She thought of her grandmother's stories, of the quiet battles fought in the shadows, of the way her ancestors had turned silence into a weapon. Naomi wasn't here to shout or protest. She was here to dismantle, to expose, to rebuild. The system that had tried to erase her was now unraveling under its own weight, and she hadn't even raised her voice. Chloe's voice cracked as she addressed the crowd, her forced smile crumbling. "We're working on it, please be patient," she called, but the passengers weren't listening, their frustration boiling over into shouts. Lucas stood beside her, his brown eyes wide with panic, his hands trembling as he tried to reboot the system, but the screens flickered again, a final glitch that plunged the gate into chaos. Naomi remained still, her hazel eyes locked on Chloe, her silver pendant glinting like a flame. The terminal was a powder keg, and Naomi held the match. As the chaos deepened, what devastating blow was Naomi Sinclair about to deliver? By early afternoon, Miami International Airport's Terminal D had descended into a maelstrom of chaos, the once polished facade of efficiency shattered beyond repair. The harsh sunlight streaming through the glass walls cast jagged shadows across, the marble floors illuminating a scene of disarray, passengers shouting at the counter, their voices a cacophony of frustration over delayed flights and canceled connections, screens flickering with error messages, their displays frozen in a loop of failure, and staff members scrambling to regain control, their navy uniforms damp with sweat, their faces pale with panic. Gate 17, the epicenter of the storm, was a battlefield, where the system's fractures had finally erupted, and at the heart of it all sat Naomi Sinclair, her emerald green blazer a beacon of calm amidst the turmoil, her silver curls shimmering like a crown of fire under the fluorescent lights. Her hazel eyes, sharp and unyielding, watched the chaos unfold with the quiet satisfaction of a strategist who'd played her opening move to perfection. Chloe Patterson stood behind the counter, her auburn hair now a tangled mess, her freckled face ghostly pale, her green eyes wide with a fear she could no longer mask. Her navy blazer hung loose on her frame, the nameplate on her chest a cruel irony as she tried to placate the crowd, her voice cracking with every word. "We're doing everything we can," she shouted, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the counter, her fingers white-knuckled. But the passengers weren't listening, their anger boiling over into accusations. "You've ruined my meeting. I'm missing my daughter's wedding." Each shout a dagger that pierced Chloe's crumbling facade. She turned to Lucas, the junior staffer with curly black hair and anxious brown eyes, who stood beside her, his own uniform disheveled, his hands fumbling with a handheld radio that crackled with static. "What's happening now?" she demanded, her voice shrill. Lucas's brown eyes were wide with panic as he stammered, "The regional manager, they're on the line. They're saying Sinclair Ventures has pulled all contracts, they're done with us." Chloe's face drained of what little color remained, her green eyes darting to Naomi, a flicker of realization cutting through her fear. She'd dismissed the wrong woman. In the glass-walled office overlooking the gate, shift supervisor Dennis Marks sat slumped in his chair, his thinning gray hair slick with sweat, his gray suit jacket discarded on the floor. His wiry frame trembled as he stared. At the phone on his desk, the line now dead after a call that had sealed his fate. Two executives from corporate compliance, both in dark suits, stood over him, their faces grim as they delivered the news. Sinclair Ventures had not only frozen contracts, but had initiated a cascade of withdrawals across their entire network, a move that threatened to cripple the airline's operations nationwide. "They're a cornerstone client," one of the executives said, his voice tight with barely restrained panic. "They handle logistics for underserved markets we rely on. If they walk, we lose millions." Dennis's hands shook as he looked out the window, his gaze locking on Naomi, her emerald green blazer a symbol of the reckoning he'd failed to foresee. He'd signed off on the reassignment, a decision made in the name of brand image. But now that decision was a noose around his neck. Grace, the young flight attendant with a brunette ponytail, stood near the jet bridge, her navy uniform still crisp but her brown eyes brimming with tears. The weight of her silence had become unbearable, a chain she could no longer bear. She'd watched Chloe dismiss Naomi, heard Lucas's whispered confession, seen the system's bias play out in real time and done nothing. But now, as the terminal crumbled, she felt a spark of courage ignite within her. She took a deep breath, her hands steadying as she approached the counter, her voice trembling but firm. "I need to report something," she said to Chloe, her brown eyes blazing with newfound resolve. "What happened here? It wasn't right. The reassignment, the comments, it was wrong." Chloe's green eyes widened, her mouth opening to protest, but Grace cut her off, her voice growing stronger. "I won't be silent anymore." She turned away, her brunette ponytail swaying as she marched toward the operations office, her courage a small but vital crack in the system's foundation. Naomi watched Grace's act of defiance, her hazel eyes softening with a flicker of respect. She knew the cost of speaking up, the way it could unravel a career, a life. But she also knew its power, the way it could spark change in the darkest corners. Her phone buzzed again, a fourth message from her executive assistant. "Allies mobilized. Press notified." The words were a quiet confirmation, a signal that the storm was no longer silent, it was roaring. Naomi stood, her emerald green blazer catching the light, her silver pendant, the hummingbird from her grandmother, glinting like a flame at her throat. She thought of her ancestors, of the quiet battles they'd fought, of the way they'd turned silence into a weapon. Naomi wasn't here to shout, she was here to dismantle, to expose, to rebuild. The system that had tried to erase her was now on its knees, and she hadn't even spoken a word. Chloe's voice broke as she turned to Naomi, her green eyes pleading, her freckled face a mask of desperation. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "Fix this." But Naomi's hazel eyes were cold, her silver curls a crown of unyielding resolve. The terminal was a battlefield, and Naomi held the high ground. As the chaos reached its peak, what final strike was Naomi Sinclair about to deliver? As the afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon, casting a warm amber glow through the glass walls of Miami International Airport's Terminal D, the chaos that had gripped Gate 17 began to settle, leaving behind a wreckage of shattered systems and broken illusions. The screens above the counter, once flickering with error messages, now displayed a stark notice. All flights delayed, until further notice. Passengers had dispersed, some resigned to waiting, others storming off in frustration, their shouts fading into a dull murmur. The terminal, once a battlefield, now felt like the aftermath of a storm. A quiet, heavy stillness that bore the weight of what had been lost and what had been gained. At the heart of it all stood Naomi Sinclair, her emerald green blazer a symbol of unyielding resolve, her silver curls shimmering like a crown in the fading light, her hazel eyes reflecting a quiet triumph. Her charcoal gray leather briefcase rested by her feet, a silent testament to the battle she'd fought and won. Chloe Patterson slumped against the counter, her auburn hair a tangled mess, her freckled face streaked with tears, her green eyes hollow with defeat. Her navy blazer hung loose on her frame, her nameplate a bitter reminder of the role she'd played in her own downfall. She'd begged Naomi to fix this, but Naomi's silence had been her answer, a silence that spoke louder than any words. Chloe's hands trembled as she opened her phone, her fingers shaking as she typed a message, not to her supervisor, not to HR, but to Naomi herself. "I was wrong," she wrote, her words raw and unfiltered, a confession born from the wreckage of her actions. "I saw you and I judged you and I let the system tell me who you were. I'm sorry." She hit send, her green eyes brimming with tears, her breath hitching as she faced the cost of her complicity. In the glass-walled office overlooking the gate, shift supervisor Dennis Marks sat alone, his thinning gray hair disheveled, his gray suit jacket discarded on the floor. His wiry frame was slumped in his chair, his hands covering his face as the reality of his choices crashed over him. The executives from corporate compliance had left, their parting words a death knell for his career. "Sinclair Ventures has severed all ties. We're facing lawsuits, audits, and a PR nightmare. You approve the reassignment, you'll take the fall." Dennis's hands shook as he thought of his years of service, of the system he'd trusted, of the biases he'd upheld in the name of brand image. He'd lost everything, not because of Naomi's wrath, but because of his own failure to see the humanity in the woman he'd dismissed. Lucas, the junior staffer with curly black hair and anxious brown eyes, stood near the counter, his navy uniform wrinkled, his hands steady for the first time that day. He'd submitted a formal report to corporate, detailing the reassignment, the whispered orders, the systemic bias that had enabled it all. It wasn't a grand gesture, but a quiet act of accountability, a step toward breaking the silence he'd once been complicit in. Grace, the young flight attendant with a brunette ponytail, stood beside him, her brown eyes clear with resolve. Her report to the operations office had sparked an internal investigation, a small but vital crack in the system's foundation. "I couldn't stay silent anymore," she said to Lucas, her voice steady, her navy uniform a symbol of the courage she'd finally found. Together, they watched the terminal settle, their actions a spark of hope amidst the wreckage. Naomi Sinclair stood at the center of it all, her emerald green blazer catching the amber light, her silver pendant, the hummingbird from her grandmother, glinting like a beacon of resilience. Her phone buzzed one final time, a message from her executive assistant. New partnership secured. Summit scheduled. The words were a confirmation of the future Naomi had already begun to build, a future where dignity wasn't a privilege but a foundation. The following week, she convened a summit in Atlanta, gathering community leaders, tech innovators, and advocates for equity. Around a long mahogany table, they shared stories of struggle and resilience, drafting plans for systems built on transparency, accountability, and empathy. Naomi spoke, her voice steady, her hazel eyes blazing with purpose. "We're not here to patch the old," she said. "We're here to create the new, a world where no one is erased by a glance, This story isn't just a tale of triumph, it's a mirror for our own lives, a testament to the power of moral courage in the face of modern struggles. In 2025, as industries grapple with systemic bias and the fight for equity, Naomi's journey reflects the Black struggles that persist from the Jim Crow era to today's corporate corridors. Her quiet resilience teaches us that true justice begins with refusing to accept the unacceptable, with the courage to act decisively against systemic change. Whether in airports, boardrooms, or our communities, we all have a role to play in dismantling bias and building a world where dignity is universal. If Naomi's story moved you, if it inspired you to rethink what justice and resilience look like, then join us. Subscribe to our channel to keep the conversation going. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a story. Share your thoughts below. What inspired you most? Where are you watching from? Let's stand together, not just to listen, but to lead, to make inspiring change a reality in our lives. Thank you for being here. Your support fuels stories that matter.